12 o'clock. The old church bells rang out into the darkness, sending a flock of pigeons into disarray, cooing and flapping violently away from the aged building. Each slow chime echoed through the cavernous inner hall, reverberating off the ancient stone, bouncing between each red velvet-lined pew and finally laying to rest upon the altar. Vermon and her mother exited the church, hand in hand. The weather made Vermon smile, for she loved gloomy days. The sky was gray and the smell of rain filled her nose with delight. What an amazing lecture that was, her mother said with half-smile. Death has always fascinated me. Vermon hated death and the idea of it. It scared her. She cared about what happened after she would die. "What happens when you die, Mommy?" she asked. She wanted to ask before, but the preach wouldn't give her that chance. Anyone who talks during the lectures is immediately banned from the church. Rules were firm and strict. Drops of rain splashed on their heads. "Goodness, I forgot the umbrella at home. We have to hurry." The two of them reached the sidewalk, then ran towards their house, which is very nearby the church. By the time they reached the front door, the rain was pouring down. The sound of rain hitting cars calmed Vermon. She loved it much. Once they were in the house, Vermon quickly removed her shoes and coat. Her mother put Vermon's items in the closet neatly. "What happens when you die, Mommy?" she asked again while following her mother to the kitchen. "When you die," her mother pulled a cutting board from one of the cabinets. "You are either sent to heaven or hell." "That's not true," Vermon said. "Grandma says it's not true. Why don't you tell me the truth?" Her mother puts the cutting board down, then examined her daughter. Any trace of a smile disappeared from her mother's face. The reason the church had discussed death was due to the passing of Vermon's grandmother. Ignoring her mother's silence, she ran out into the backyard with an umbrella and her sandals. Vermon kneeled down and placed her hand over the clump of dirt. She giggled. A gust of wind danced through Vermon's hair. "What's so funny?" her grandmother's voice asked. "Every time I touch the dirt it tickles my hand and eyes," Vermon replied. Another gust of wind came. "You're so silly. Did you go to church today?" "Yes. We talked about death. David said when people die they go to hell or heaven. But you're still here." There was no gust of the wind as Vermon waited for a reply. "Nana," she said. Still no reply. "Okay, talk to you later," she said, then ran into the house. Vermon spent most of her recess sitting on the grass, watching the other kids play. In front of her were two small boys playing basketball. Behind her was a group of girls talking about those boys and how cute they were. Vermon stretched out her arms behind her. She let out a giggle so loud that the girls behind her take notice. A strong gust of wind threw her hair back, making the girls that were behind her gasp. "Kill them. Kill them all," the voice in the air said. It was the voice of an old man. "Why?" Vermon asked. Another gust of wind flew through her hair. The girls behind her started screaming, then they ran away. "Because they're murderers," the voice said. "Piper, Pepper, and Lynn. Piper, Pepper, and Lynn," she repeated. "Come back tonight at 8:45 p.m., the voice said. "I'll show you. Bring someone so they can see." "If you won't come, I'll just go myself," Vermon said with a pout. She put her fork down and stared at her fish and tomatoes. "You're 8 years old," her mother responded. "I'm not letting you go to school alone at night. Now finish your dinner." Her mother took her own plate and washed it in the sink. Vermon struggled to eat the soggy fish. She disliked her mother's cooking with a passion. Her food was never as good as her father's when he was alive. After she was done eating, Vermon placed her plate in the kitchen sink, then went up to her room. Later around 7:45 she made her mother a cup of tea. Before giving it to her she decided to sneak a sleeping pill inside. Vermon knew well of her mother's pills and she knew this one would put her out cold in 5 minutes. She stirred it in with the tea. Vermon walked into her mother's room without knocking but found her to be sleeping with a book on her chest. Vermon quietly placed the tea on the small desk that was next to her mother's bed. She went into her room, grabbed her coat, an emergency cell phone, some gloves, a flashlight, a watch, and screwdriver for protection. Vermon unlocked the front door and slipped out into the cold night. The walk to school was quite far. Night had fallen fast upon the land. No more than an hour ago the sky was painted with hues of red, orange and pink, but all color had faded, leaving only a matte black canvas with no stars to be looked upon. Breaking into the school playground was easy. There was no security. Just a fence with a lock that could easily be climbed over. Vermon read her watch. 8:21 p.m. Vermon ran to the spot where she spoke with the dead old man. She took off her gloves and felt around the cold grass. Her flashlight dimmed and Vermon hoped it wouldn't die now. She could see the air from her breath around the light of the flashlight. Almost giving up, she finally felt a tingle through her hand and around her eyes. She chuckled. A gust of wind flew through her hair, causing her to shiver. Right on time, the old man's voice said. Sure enough, her watch read 8:45. Vermon nodded, looking at the ground. Now what? Pepper, Piper, and Lynn. Do you know them? No. Do you know Mr. Wilson? The old principal. There you go. They say he retired then left the country. They said that last year. I didn't go missing. Piper, Pepper, and Lynn killed me. They're murders. I won't rest until they're behind bars. Why did they murder you? Because I fired Lynn. They're sisters. One of them is your homeroom teacher, but you call her Mrs. Brady. Wow, Vermon said. Why did you want me to come here at 8:45? I thought you wanted to show me something. Yes, they're here right now. Inside the school. Really? Yes, did you bring a cell phone? I did. Call 911. Call them and tell them what I told you. If they don't believe you, tell them that the 3 sisters are in the building right now. Oh, and the address of the school is 143, Northeast Indian Creek, 30021. Vermon took her hands off the cold grass and pulled her phone out of her pocket. She dialed 911. After one ring a woman picked up. Hello. Hi, my name is Vermon. I'd like to report a murder, she said. Vermon could see the flashing lights approaching the school building. She specifically told them she was on the playground and had hung up after she gave them the address. After 5 minutes passed, 2 cops climbed over the playground fence, while a few other cops attended the front door of the school. Vermon did tell them about the 3 sisters that had been in the building. She shone her flashlight at the officers as they approached her. All right, kid, a female cop with short brown hair and messy eyeliner said. She rested her hands on her hips. You know you can get into real trouble if you're lying. Vermon pointed to the ground. His body is right under here. She exchanged glances with the other cop, then faced Vermon. You reported a murder, kid. Mr. Wilson's body is underneath here. Pepper, Pipper, and Lynn murdered him. Pepper, Piper, and Lynn, the male officer said with a grin. The woman nudged him, reminding him to keep professional. He straightened up. Are you aware that if you're lying I'm not lying. You can check. How do you know he's under there? The woman asked, holding onto her belt. He told me. He told you? Who? Mr. Wilson. The woman shook her head. She reached for Vermon's hand but she snatched it away. Come on, kid. We're going to get you home. The woman got a hold of Vermon. Look, the others are coming. The male officer said, pointing at 2 cops heading their way. Behind the two cops were three women in handcuffs. "This ought to be good," the female officer said, crossing her arms over her chest. Vermon struggled to get away, but the officer kept her in place until the others arrived. "These three were stealing from school charity boxes," an officer said. "They're drugged up on coke or something. Don't even remember their names." The three women all looked dazed and out of it. Vermon pointed to all three women. "That's Pepper, Piper, and Lynn. Mr. Wilson told me so." One of the women lazily looked at Vermon. "Wilson what?" "Wilson's dead." The officer holding Vermon now crossed her arms once more. "Oh yeah? How'd he die?" "He's long gone," another woman said. She then started laughing and then puked on her shoes. "Disgusting," the woman office said. "All right, get a shovel and dig right over here," she said, pointing to the ground. "Why there?" an officer asked. The woman sighed and pointed to Vermon. "Because this one claims that's where Mr. Wilson is. If she's lying, she's going to be in big trouble. This is a chance I'm willing to take. Now, get the caution tape and let's go. You are in big trouble when we get home," Vernon's mother said, pointing a finger at her daughter. Vermon didn't pay attention. She focused on the cops digging up dirt. Caution tape surrounded the diggers, and beaming lights rested on the ground. Vermon took the blanket that rested on her back off and stood up. Her mother grabbed her hand and pulled her back down. "Stay down," she told her. "It's been 45 minutes, guys. Should we call it in?" Someone called out. "Keep digging," the female officer called out. Vernon's mother lowered her head in embarrassment. "I swear when we get home, I will dash." "Whoa!" someone yelled from behind the caution tape. All of a sudden everyone was quiet. Vermon burst from her mother's hands and ran towards the caution tape. An officer stopped her immediately. "Well, great God Almighty," the woman officer said, looking inside the hole. A skull laid face down, planted in the dirt with shattered bones here and there. The officer stood in shock. The fact that there was indeed a skeleton underneath sent chills throughout her body. The officer holding Vermon let her go just so he could see all the action. "My goodness," he said, shining his flashlight at the bones. Vermon crawled under the tape and stared into the hole. "I told you," she whispered, only loud enough for the female officer to hear. "All right guys, show's over. This is a crime scene," the female officer said. Vernon's mother rushed to the scene. She gasped and held her mouth as she saw the bones graved into the ground. Vermon smiled. Now he can rest in peace. She felt a gust of wind dance through her hair but heard no voices. "You're welcome," she called out. During school, Vermon was the center of attention. Not in a way she'd like, though. Everyone stared at her as if she were some alien creature. Kids stopped in the hallways whenever she would walk by. Teachers were speechless around her. No one said anything. You'd think being on the front paper would be exciting, however, when you get the nickname, Ghost Whisperer, no one really wants to talk to you. "Hey, Venom." A boy called her name during lunchtime. Vermon turned around. "It's Vermon," she replied. "It should be Venom." "You freak," he said. Vermon turned her back to him and stared at her lunch. Cold pizza on a cold day surrounded by cold people. No one talked to Vermon during lunch and it got real depressing. Not even the few friends she had spoken to her. 8. After school, Vermon sat on the school bench and waited for her mother to pick her up. While waiting, she was approached by an unfamiliar old woman holding a handkerchief in her hand. She had stacks of bags underneath eyes. Her face was pale and full of sadness. She sat next to Vermon but looked straight ahead. "Everyone's saying you have a gift," the old woman stated. The two of them made eye contact, and the longer Vermon stared at her, the more she was able to realize who she's sitting next to. It's the lunch lady. Yes. But people are afraid of me now, Vermon says. No one talks to me anymore since the newspapers. A few kids and their parents whispered as they walked by Vermon, then spoke louder when they were away from her. The old woman nods her head slowly. It's Gift. You're special, Vermon. She placed her hand over Vermon's. I need your help. I will give you $300 if you help me reach my daughter. Help me talk to her. Vermon, her mother shouted from a distance. Come on. Vermon turned away from her mother and faced the old woman. I will help you. Her mother angrily approached them. Young lady, how dare you turn away from me while I'm talking to you? The cafeteria lady needs help, Mommy, she said. The old woman stood up and stuck out her hand for a handshake. It's June. Nice to meet you. Jacqueline, how do you do? She shook the woman's hand briefly. I'm offering your daughter $300 if she can help me reach my daughter, June said. Jacqueline smiled sympathetically. We're not a business, and I'm afraid this is not something I want her to get into. June pulled money from her purse and shoved it into Jacqueline's hand desperately. $1,000. Please, I need to know the truth. Vermon and her mother exchanged glances. Even though Jacqueline hated the idea of her daughter doing this, she would never turn down $1,000. The graveyard was no more than a series of wooden crosses of random sizes stuck in the grassy loam. Mostly they were painted white and bore a scribbled name, perhaps a date. June led them past mossy tombstones and old gargoyle statues. These are creepy statues, Jacqueline said. She had to be careful not to accidentally hit her head against a wing or arm from the statues. Gargoyles are for the wicked. Angels are for the good. June said. Who are we to say so? Vermon asked. What if the man buried underneath that gargoyle was good and was put there by mistake? She looked at the gargoyle statue whose gray rocky head faced the sky with its hands clawed out, also facing the sky. June chuckled. I don't think he was put there by mistake, she said, looking at the statue. June stopped in front of a white tombstone. It read, Taken too soon. R.I.P. Anna Sophia. 1992 to 2016. She died this year, Vermon said. She died last week, June said. Her stepfather was visiting her. He never liked her. Never had they liked each other, and he visits the day she dies. I just know it was him, but he claimed that she killed herself. Her death was ruled as a suicide, but I say murder. Vermon gave June a chance to wipe her tears away. Let's find out, she said, putting her hand on the dirt. Vernon's hair fluttered up, startling June and Jacqueline. A gentle wind briefly flew against her face. Hello. A soft voice said. Hi, Vermon said with a smile. I'm Vermon. Your mother is here and we would like to ask you a question. What question? How did you die? She said. There was a long silence. June watched as Vermon's hair constantly fluttered around. She eagerly waited an answer. Vermon finally removed her hands off of the dirt and faced June. I'm sorry. Your daughter says sorry too, but it was suicide. June immediately broke out into tears. But why? She said through her sobs. She said you didn't pay attention to her. You wasn't there when she needed you. Vermon said. She then placed a hand on June. But she says she's better now and that Maxwell is with her. A smile grew on June's face. She's with her brother, she whispered. June then hugged Vermon. Bless you. Vermon watched as June wiped her tears away and laughed to herself. She seemed to be happy to hear that her daughter wasn't alone and that she was better. Jacqueline took Vermon's hand and smiled at her. Come on, you. Vermon was feeling good about what she had done. They passed the gargoyle statues again, and as they did, Vermon noticed something. The gargoyle's face no longer faced the sky. It faced her. The cold stone eyes looked at her as if it stored emotions of anger inside it. The claws also faced her, creating an image in Vernon's mind that the statue would come alive and grab her at any moment. She quickly turned away and held on tight to her mother's hand. Vermon found it very hard to sleep that night. The gargoyle statue played through her mind and kept her from sleeping. She sat up and looked toward her window. In her mind, perhaps the gargoyle was a sign. If not, it could be something worse. Around 11 p.m., after Jacqueline had fallen asleep, Vermon slipped out into the night yet again. Her mother's warnings weren't a threat to her, and she did not fear them. With her flashlight in hand, Vermon walked down the streets, past the stores, past the old church, and into the town's graveyard. The cold air thickened around her as she entered, making her wish she had bought a coat instead of a jacket. She stopped and looked at the graves. So many souls buried underneath. So many lives taken too soon. And for what? Vermon would wonder. What was the point? To the left of her was a simple grave covered in moss and cobwebs. The gravestone read, Toby Wilson. 1965 to 200. Vermon set her flashlight on the ground and touched the dirt Toby lied under. Hello. Vermon said. Who's there? Vermon. Weird name. Do I know you? No. But I can speak to the dead. Silence. Are you there? She asked. Go away, he said. Weird. Vermon sat up and frowned. What a rude man, she said aloud. She then moved on to another grave that was shadowed by an angel statue. This one read, Olivia Peters. 1821 to 1836. Hello. Vermon said. Hello, Vermon. Wow. Vermon said with a smile. You know my name. How? I was a fortune-tell, and I predicted you a long time ago. Wow. And I'm glad I'm able to warn you now, Vermon. Warn me? She asked. Why? Warn me of what? If you don't stop talking to the dead, there will be dire consequences, Olivia said. Right after she said that, a heavy breeze blew against Vermon's face, making it hard to breathe. She turned the other way until the wind stopped hitting her face. She removed her hand off of the dirt. A noise followed after the wind stopped, startling Vermon. It sounded like someone had scraped their sharp nails against one of the tombstones. It lasted for a few seconds, then stopped. She turned and faced the directions the sounds. Something in the graveyard was moving. Too afraid to shine her flashlight at the shadowy thing, she turned around and attempted to leave. She stopped in her tracks when she heard a strange voice call her name. She turned around and shone her flashlight ahead of her. Standing completely out of place, swaying its arms the same way a person would wave at themselves when hot, was the gargoyle statue. Before Vermon could react, she felt a presence behind her. She could feel the hot air on her neck as if someone stood behind her breathing. She slowly turned her head around, positive someone was behind her. Nothing. She quickly turned back towards the gargoyle, but it was gone. As she shone her flashlight around, she could see that the gargoyle sat in the same position it was when she first saw it, facing the sky. Vermon took a deep breath, then walked towards the gargoyle statue, curious for answers to the question she held. Vermon's face was almost as cold as ice. Towering her was the gargoyle, and underneath it was the gravestone it rested on. She was able to read the faded words. Cody Anderson. 2010 to 2016, Vermon raised her eyebrows, shocked that the person buried was only 6. Why did a 6-year-old have a gargoyle on his gravestone? Vermon took a deep breath, ready to ask questions. However, before she could touch the dirt, she was startled by footsteps. Vermon Avery Simon, her mother yelled, reaching for Vermon's hand. Why can't you listen to a damn thing I say? A fog swirled around their legs, appearing out of nowhere. Her mother shook her head. Come on, let's get you home. Come on, hold out your hand, Vermon's mother said, holding out a long and thin piece of wood she found outside. For more. Vermon bit her lip with each blow to her hand. She just knew her hand would be red for days. Mother, I was just talking to the dead people. She pointed out. The mother pointed at her. I understand if you do it to help people, but don't stick your nose in the dead's business. Keep it up and one day you'll find out something you don't want to hear. Vermon frowned and walked over to the kitchen sink. Okay, she said, grabbing a cup from out of the cabinet. Her mother got up from her chair. Before heading to bed she put bells on the door just in case Vermon wanted to have another late-night adventure. Good night, her mother said. Night, pig. Vermon murmured out of anger. Her mother didn't hear her, and that was definitely a good thing. She grabbed her flashlight off the table, then headed into her room. Instead of throwing the flashlight onto the bed, it fell onto the floor and rolled underneath her bed. She turned on her bedroom light, then crouched down on the ground. As she was on the floor reaching for the flashlight, she couldn't help but to feel uneasy about her hand being under the bed. The bed wasn't a high one, it was very low. So low, she could only slide her hand under it. Nothing could be seen underneath. She decided to give up because 1, she didn't feel her flashlight, and 2, she was scared. When she stood up she quickly looked around, scared she'd find something in the room. Nothing. She opened her door wide, then turned off the lights, only to turn around and see someone laying in her bed. The figure was big and looked heavy. Vermon quickly turned on the lights, however that was a wrong move. An old woman whose flesh fell from her skin, making her face unrecognizable, stood in front of Vermon now. She did it. It hissed quickly before disappearing. Vermon fell back to the ground. She tried to get up, but she felt a tingle in her hand again. Vermon. The voice said through the air. As her hand laid on the floor in her bedroom, she couldn't help shiver from fear. Why was there a dead body underneath her? Didn't I tell you to get ready for bed? Her mother poked her head out of her bedroom door. No, Vermon made a face. I thought I saw something. She moved her hand off of the floor. Her mother walked into Vermon's room and stared at the floor. Get up, David called. From the church? Vermon asked. Yes, he wants to see you tomorrow morning. Something about talking to his dead friend. All right, and what about school? Vermon asked. Jacqueline took a deep breath. The parents of the students signed a petition. They've removed you from school. Vermon smiled. How delightful. She stood up and faced her mother. She smiled at her daughter. Don't worry, with all this money we're going to make, we can buy you a private teacher. She took her daughter's hand and walked her over to the bed. Now, get some rest. We have a big day tomorrow. Vermon climbed into the bed and watched as her mother turned off the light, then left her room. David grabbed his 100th tissue from the box and patted his eyes dry. The sobbing didn't seem to ease up and Vermon was losing patience. Good thing the weather had been a little warmer and the sky less gloomy than the usual. Jacqueline patted David on the back and told him that he could speak whenever he's ready. Death wasn't kind. Vermon knew that. It snatched where it could, taking people who were far too young, far too good. It didn't pretend to care, it didn't pretend to distinguish. As she stood in the graveyard waiting for David to finish his crying, she couldn't help but think about death. Lately, it seemed to have followed her everywhere. It scared her. Was this life's way of telling her she's next? Was something coming for her? Okay, Vermon, David sniffed. He stood up and took Vermon's hand. David was a black man with skin as smooth as ever. He was built thick and had big muscles. Any random child would be afraid to talk to him or have him hold his hand. But Vermon wasn't scared. She looked right into his eyes. She could see a broken man. "David," she said. "We can start when you're ready." David nodded. "Yes." Of course, he let go of her hand and took a deep breath. "His name is Joseph. Ask him if he forgives me. Tell him I'm sorry." Vermon placed her hand on the ground. The gust of wind that lifted Vermon's hair frightened David, making him take a step back. "Joseph," she said. "Hello," the voice said in a happy tone. Vermon smiled at his tone of excitement. "I have a message for you from David." There was a long silence. "What is it?" "He asks for your forgiveness. He says he's sorry. Forgive and forget." Vermon looked at David. "He said forgive and forget." David smiled. "He used to always say that." He placed his hand over his heart. "Tell him I miss him." "He says he misses you," Vermon said. "I miss him too. Tell him I said to watch the road next time." Vermon faced David. "Watch the road next time." "I will," David said, wiping his tears away. David wiped more tears and cried a little bit more, only this time he was smiling rough the tears. "Thank you so much, Vermon." He lowered his hat and gestured his head at Vermon. "That was spectacular." "No problem," Vermon replied. David cleared his throat and took out a paper. "Here's a check for $200, he handed it to Vermon's mother, then placed his hat back over his head. "Farewell to you both." As David exited the graveyard, two women approached him. They began talking for a while. Vermon noticed that they would sometimes point at her, then nod their heads and point at her again. David was doing wild gestures with his hand and removed his hat, then pointed at Vermon again. After they said goodbye, the two women walked into the graveyard. "Hi, I'm Tabitha and this is my sister, Samantha," she said to Vermon. "We were wondering if it was possible to speak with my son. He died in 1996. He was only 8. I just want to tell him I love him. Sadly, I didn't get a chance to say goodbye the day he died." Vermon was cut off by her mother. "We do charge, ma'am," Jacqueline said. "Mom," Vermon said. "We have enough money at the moment." Jacqueline glared at Vermon. "I do the talking, sweetie." She looked at the two women. "I'm sorry. We do own a business. Excuse us, now." "Wait," Samantha said, placing her hand on Jacqueline's shoulder. "I have $75. Please, we ask for your kindness and mercy." Jacqueline thought about it for a second. She nodded. "Sounds fine." The conversation between Vermon, Tabitha, and her son lasted a good 20 minutes. Her son, Vladimir, talked about how much he missed her and thought about her. Tabitha told him that she left his room the way it was when he died. The conversation was beautiful and Vermon enjoyed it, until Waldmeyer said it was time to go. That struck Vermon as odd. Very odd. Where did he have to go and why? Where does the dead go? What does the dead do? She was curious. The two women thanked Vermon, gave her mother the money, then left. Jacqueline placed the money in her pocketbook. "We are going to make a fortune." "His son said he had to go," Vermon said. "Where did he go?" Jacqueline shrugged. "Beats me. I'm not dead." Vermon woke up the next day with a throbbing head. It hurt so much she could hardly get out of bed. She called her mother's name, but that made her head ache even more. Her head felt heavy and like it would explode at any minute. Her mother walked in and gasped when she saw Vermon. "What's wrong with you eyes?" Jacqueline asked. "What?" Vermon asked. Her mother got closer look. "Your eyes are gray." "I didn't know they changed colors," Vermon said. She had to close her eyes. "My head hurts." "I'll make you some peppermint tea," her mother said. "We can't have you sick. There are people lined up at the church wanting to see you." She walked out of the room. While her mother put the fire on for the kettle, Vermon's door slowly began closing. Vermon raised an eyebrow. When the door fully closed, she began hearing wailing noises around her room. Her light flickered, her dressers rattled, and her bed shook slightly. She was about to call her mother's name when she heard a hoarse whisper in the air. "Vermon, I'm in the graveyard," the voice said. Suddenly, everything that was shaking had stopped. Her mother walked in. "Why did you close the door?" "I didn't," Vermon said. "Keep it open, tea's almost done," she said. Over 25 people thanked Jacqueline at the church. Vermon was there for almost 5 hours. She had spoken to dead women, men, and children. She was exhausted and wanted to go home and rest. She sat alone outside of the church and watched the cars roll by. Exiting a small corner store was a man dressed in all white. He wore a black hat that rested on his curly mass of hair. He walked towards the church. The closer he got, the more Vermont could see his face. One eye was white with no pupil while the other, dark brown. He had a messy, uneven beard and a pencil mustache. He walked quickly and faced the ground as he did. He made his way up the stairs to where Vermon sat, then took off his hat and lowered it. "Good evening, Vermon, I'm Mr. Sanders," he said. His voice was breathy and he breathed hard after each word as if he was out of breath. "How do you do?" Vermon asked. He nodded his head quickly and wiped away invisible sweat off of his forehead. "I'm afraid I will have to ask you for a moment of your time." "It's strictly important," he said. Vermon sighed. "Sorry, you missed it. We're done talking to the dead for today. My mom's inside if you want to schedule with her tomorrow." Normally she would agree, but she was just too tired. Mr. Sanders smiled nervously while looking the ground. "Gee heavens no. This is about you, Vermon. I think you should come with me now, for your own safety." He placed his hat back on his head then walked down the stairs. Vermon looked behind her at the closed door, thinking about her mother. Surely Vermon thought she would be gone just a moment, so she thought. "Hey, wait up!" Vermon yelled. Mr. Sanders walked swiftly ahead of her, holding his hat. They'd been walking for 10 minutes. They walked past the graveyard and past the stores. The two finally reached an empty field filled with tall grass. "Fascinating. Truly fascinating," he said aloud. Vermon wondered why he kept saying fascinating every 3 minutes. He finally stopped at a small rock that rested in the middle of the field. "You can speak to the dead, correct?" Vermon nodded. "Yes." Mr. Sanders smiled. "Yes, I'm so nervous on what he wanted you for." "Me too," Vermon said. She placed her hand on a small lump of dirt and grass. Mr. Sanders gasped when he saw her hair flow. "Hello," Vermon said. "Hello. I'm Vermon. I'm here with your son," she said. "I knew you would come. What's your name?" "Vermon," she said. "You're the one." Vermon smiled. "You're the one it wants," he said. "It? Hasn't anyone told you the dead is not to be spoken with?" he said. "Your conversations with the dead has made a passageway back to Earth for Cody." "Cody? But he's only 6. Cody is a 201-year-old omen. His grave says he's 6 to avoid people from digging up his grave and making him into an attraction," he said. "He was born with the face of an owl and the body of a human being, and his body does not decay. Thus so, you must not communicate with the dead, or he will break through to Earth and take your soul." Vermon was confused. "But why me? I don't understand." There was silence. "I have to go. He follows your voice. Beware." Mr. Sanders placed a hand on her. "Your power fascinates me, it does. What bothers me is that people who are able to speak to the dead, have a past full of violence and evil. Tell me, Vermon. Who raises you?" My mother. Is she evil? Vermon shook her head. No. She then thought about what was underneath her floor. Who was under there, and why? She needed answers and she needed them fast. If I wasn't making all this money I would ground you, Vermon's mother said. Her face was bright red. How dare you follow a stranger? Vermon sat with her head down. She let her mother lecture her without any backtalk until she finally left the room. When she left, Vermon closed the door and got onto the floor. She was about to place her hand over the floor when the lights flicked again. Vermon, I'm outside of the grave, the whisper said. She quickly placed her hand onto the floor where she had last time. A powerful wind blew against her face. Vermon, the voice said. It was a male's voice. Vermon, you have to run, sweetie. This is Daddy. Run. Dad, she said quickly. Why are you underneath my floor? What happened? She didn't see that one coming. Why, she lost her dad when she was 5. Jacqueline walked in. She had on a coat. Get off the damn floor, she said, zipping up her coat. Where are you going? Vermon asked. We need more milk, she said. Be right back, and I promise if you leave I will use the stick on you. Vermon nodded. Okay. As soon as Jacqueline left, Vermon placed her hand on the floor again. Hello, she said, but there was no wind. She felt the floor in many other places but got nothing in return. Suddenly, something fell from inside of her closet. She opened the closet door and saw the book, Goodnight Moon, lying on the ground. She picked it up and placed it all the way at the top. That's when she noticed a light green stain on her wall. One she never noticed before. She touched it, wanting to see if it was wet from a water leakage maybe. However, she was shocked when her hair began to flutter from the wind. Get out, a deep and slow voice said. It made her heart stop because she did not expect a response coming from behind the wall. Vermon entered her mom's room. She was careful how long she would be inside before her mom returned from the store. She felt around her mom's floor but had not heard any voices. She then began to touch the walls but still nothing. She moved on to her mother's closest. Piled on the floor were a few books and pictures. That wasn't what she was looking for, so she ignored it. She sat in the living room and waited for her mother to return. Part of her was truly frightened. Even though most lights in the house were on, everything felt so dark. Then, out of the blue, Vermon's bedroom door began closing on its own. When it closed shut, she was able to see the front of 2 pairs of feet poking out from underneath the door. The toenails were sharp and long. Vermon hugged her knees while watching the feet. Then, all the lights in the house shut off. Her heart raced. A loud bang made Vermon jump with fear. She could see nothing but she heard breathing. Heavy, loud wheezing, and not just from one voice, it came from different voices all around her. The lights turned back on, and this time, perched on the chair sitting next to her was a person. Their head faced away from Vermon, but their body sat up straight. Vermon stopped breathing. The person sitting next to her turned its head, slowly sending sickening cracking noises into the air. Vermon screamed. This person did not have the face of a human's. It had the face of an owl. The lights went off, then turned back on again. Jacqueline walked inside of the house but dropped her bags when she looked at Vermon. Vermon, she whispered, approaching her. She stared at her daughter for the longest time. Your eyes are getting darker. I don't see a problem here, the doctor said, swinging his small torch light over her eyes. He adjusts the chair for Vermon to sit up. It is normal for the eye to change color. It's almost black, Vermon said. The doctor smiled. But it's not completely black. Jacqueline took Vermon's hand as they drew closer to the church. Vermon thought they were heading home. There were over 50 people hanging outside of the church. When they saw her, They cheered and waved their hands in the air. Here she comes. The graveyard girl. Praise the Almighty. The people got louder and louder as they approached Vermon. She backed away, shaking her head, wanting to refuse everyone. Fake, someone yelled out. Fraud. Vermon was completely surrounded by the crowd. A few people argued back and forth about whether she was a fraud or not. Someone even mentioned her mother was in it to make money. Behind the crowd were a few TV anchors, recording the crowd. Vermon did her best to push through the crowd. Her mother told everyone to act like civilized adults or no one gets to talk to their loved ones today. The people began to back away. One at a time, ladies and gentlemen, Jacqueline shouted. Vermon tugged her mother's shirt. Mom, I can't talk to the dead anymore. Something's trying to get me. Her mother shook her head. Nonsense. Pick someone and let's go to the graveyard. The crowd began to raise their hand and shout Vermon's name. Vermon faced them. I can't do this anymore, she called out to the crowd. Why not? The crowd began to lower their voices. We didn't come this far for a no. Yeah. Jacqueline looked at Vermon. What are you doing? Are you trying to make us look bad? Mom, I can't do it, she shouted. I've awakened something. Something with the body of a human and the head of an owl. Some people in the crowd began laughing. I'm serious. Vermon shouted. She then broke through the crowd and ran off the church's property. The crowd booed at her and her mother. Jacqueline called after her, but Vermon ignored her and ran home. The front door was open. She locked it, then went out the back door and into the backyard where her grandmother was buried. She placed her hand over the dirt. Nana, I'm so scared, Vermon said. There was no wind this time. Just a grim voice that floated through the air. Vermon, I'm outside your house. Her hair then fluttered. Vermon, listen to our warnings. Run, her grandmother said. Her voice sounded different. Almost like a toy losing its battery, drooping and slow. Run where? Vermon wondered. Where could she go? Vermon sat on her bed while looking at her bedroom door, afraid of what might enter or even exit it. Everything around her felt alive. Her desk, her books, her door, her lamp. Every second that went by made her more and more anxious. To make matters worse, her mother hadn't returned home. That's when Vermon decided to go into her mother's room again. She headed straight to the closet. The books and photographs were still spread out on her closet floor. Vermon sat next to them and began looking through them. The first one she picked up was one of her grandmother's. Vermon smiled at the picture, missing the time her Nana was alive. The number 322 was at the top of the picture and Vermon had no clue what it meant. She grabbed another picture. This time it was a picture of her. At the top of hers was the number 323. She grabbed another picture. It was of her father's and at the top, there was the number 321. Every picture had a number at the top. She moved the pictures out of the way and looked at the books. They were large heavy books with titles in a foreign language printed onto them. She opened one and saw pictures of naked women and men with arrows pointed to each part of their bodies. Written next to them were small symbols and words Vermon couldn't comprehend. She opened another book which landed on a page with a severed finger taped onto it. Vermon jolted back, throwing the book against the wall. The finger plopped out of the book and fell on top of one of the pictures. In a slow motion like movement, the finger entered the picture as if dissolving straight into it. Vermon stood up to get a better look. The entire picture turned black and a thick liquid began oozing out of it. The finger rose from it then gestured for Vermon. Vermon, I'm in the house, something whispered. The picture oozed into a large mess on the floor. Vermon ran out of her mother's bedroom and closed the door behind her. She was about to run into the living room when she saw something waiting at the door. Someone's naked body with different features of a human. It had 2 left feet, 1 perfect knee and the other twisted. 2 left hands and 1 perfect arm while the other twisted. Its face was that of an owl, large black oval eyes and light brown and white fur. What chilled Vermon to the bone, is that it also had thick curly hair and 2 human eyebrows. This was a creation beyond evil and twisted. Every time it blinked made Vermon's legs weaker and weaker. "I'm in your living room," it said, then faded away before her eyes. Vermon's mother unlocked the front door and walked inside. Vermon stared at her, scared at what she had seen just a moment ago. "There's something after me, Mom. You have to believe me." She ran into her mother's arms. "He's in here." Jacqueline rubbed Vermon's hair. "Shush, everything's going to be okay," she said, leading Vermon to the couch. When Vermon sat down, her mother went into the kitchen. "You know you still have more people to talk to." Vermon sighed. "I'm not talking to any more dead people," she yelled out. "Why aren't you listening? All you care about is the money, but I'm in danger." Jacqueline scowled at her. "Nothing is after you. It's all in your head. Now, I told those people that you'll be there at 7. You 2 hours to get your act together." Vermon stood up and walked toward the door. "If you're not going to help me, then I'll find someone who will." She then ran out of the house, shutting the door behind her. She walked a few feet away from the house, but when she looked back she saw her mother staring out the window. She then saw something behind her mother, staring at her. It had 2 large eyes, a beak, and human hair. Vermon began to cry out of fear. She didn't expect for things to turn out like this. Why didn't her mother listen to her? The more she thought about it, the angrier she got, and the angrier she got, the more she heard the sounds of laughter coming from behind her. She stopped in her tracks and listened. There was no more laughter, but her eyes felt funny. She rubbed them. As she stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, people began to look at her. Some dropped their bags and gasped. "What?" Vermon said as people stopped to point at her. "Her eyes." A young man gasped. "They're black," a woman screamed, then fainted onto the ground. "She's no gift," a man in front of a store holding a butcher knife said. "She's a curse. The graveyard girl is a curse and is here to spread evil." "No. I'm Dash." She stopped talking when she saw the butcher man walking towards her with his knife pointing in her direction. "Get out of this town, you smut," he yelled. Other people began walking towards her. Vermon covered her eyes. "I'm not evil," she yelled, running across the street to reach the other sidewalk. Only, she didn't pay attention to the cars. A jeep swerved, out of control, trying to avoid Vermon. 2 oncoming cars tried to avoid it, and failed. Both of them hit in a 3-way head-on collision. There was an explosion, a ball of flame and a fist of gray smoke. A moment later there was another explosion. Another car that hadn't been paying attention to the accident plowed into the burning wrecks, flipped over and continued, screeching along the runway on its back before it too burst into flames. Vermon was in the middle of it all. The pain that once burned like a fire had faded away to an icy numbness. Black filled the edges of Vermon's vision, and the only thing she could hear was her own heartbeat. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Seconds passed as she laid there, then, she heard voices. People swarmed all over her, trying to help her, she realized. They wanted to save her. Surely they could tell that it was far too late for her to be saved, yet they were like children, naive to the darkness of the real world. The despair and suffering of the world that took everyone she loved away from her. She closed my eyes, waiting curiously for what would come next. She took her last breath. Vermon's funeral was private. The funeral service was slower than a country bus, taking just as many detours. Everyone had a memory to share, a favorite hymn to sing. Whoever arranged it must have agreed to every request. By halfway through, some of the old deers were swaying on their feet, and were it not for the keen spring wind pushing through the open church doors, there might have been more to bury than just vermin. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jacqueline," the priest said. He sat next to her and sighed. "She is with her grandmother." Jacqueline shook her head. "No, she's not," she said, then stood up and walked over to Vermon's coffin. She leaned her head over Vermon's dead and burned body. "Vermon, can you hear me?" she asked. Jacqueline didn't get an answer, but yet, Vermon did hear her. She stood next to her mother, looking at her own body, watching as the people gathered to bury her. So this was death, she thought. Wherever the coffin went, she went. She hoped not to be trapped under the ground forever, in the darkness. Was this it? Would she never know the answer to everything? Why her mother used her? Why her mother had those books and pictures? Why her eyes turned black and that creature was after her? As the people lowered Vermon's body into the ground, Vermon glared at her mother. No tears had been in Jacqueline's eyes, no sadness, no emotion. In fact, she smiled as she watched her daughter go into the ground. People began throwing dirt onto the coffin. Jacqueline threw something onto the coffin, but it wasn't dirt. It was a picture of Vermon, and at the top, it read, 323 with a line over it. Vermon reached a hand out of the graveyard, followed by her body. A woman that was in the graveyard screamed when she saw Vermon's body, now possessed by Cody. Her eyes were fully blackened and her head just like Cody's. She had his features, his owl face, his arms, and legs. The woman ran away as fast as she could, past Jacqueline and out of the graveyard. Jacqueline walked inside the graveyard and saw her daughter's possessed body. "One more," Jacqueline said. "I've got the money to get your body out of here so I can set you free. We just need 1,500 more. Immiscible. Why haven't you raised enough money to get me out yet?" Cody asked. "Do you wish to be immortal?" Jacqueline nodded quickly. "Yes, more than anything. You didn't give me enough time to use Vermon. The dead ones told her you were after her, and her grandmother spoke to her through whispers to warn her. If you were a better parent and had put your foot on the ground. I cannot waste another day in this graveyard. Find your next victim. You cannot go over 333. We'll do the rituals at midnight. Have the money by then and get my grave removed so I can be free. Yes, and if I do, you will make me immoral, right?" she asked. Cody smacked her in the face. "Of course, but first get me out. She's not in my full control until the 333 are dead and the ritual is completed. We came a long way for this. Your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and your great-great-mother has tried. Don't disappoint them." Jacqueline nodded. "I know the perfect person," she said. "Hurry," Cody said, then disappeared. Vermon's body was sent back to her grave. She didn't hear her mother's conversation with Cody. In fact, she was unaware of the possession. She sat in her dark and cold grave until she heard the voice. The voice that came from the person who hid in the graveyard behind the stones unnoticed by Cody and Jacqueline. "Vermon." "I knew she was evil," the voice said. Vermon heard him but she couldn't respond back. "This is Mr. Sanders. I know you can hear me, Vermon, and here's what I want you to do," he said. "Your mother is going to perform the final ritual tonight." Mr. Sanders said. "You have to find the picture that's buried with you and burn it. You have to do it fast. I'll start a fire here, and you get the picture. You have an hour to walk the earth once you get that picture. Don't let Cody stop you. He can't harm the dead until he's set free." Vermon heard everything. She felt around but couldn't feel anything. She looked around, but couldn't see anything. How was she going to find it? She thought to herself. She didn't give up. Everything she grabbed or reached for felt like air. She didn't even feel like she was underground. Underground. She thought. Her mother had thrown the picture on top of her coffin. She looked up. She couldn't see anything or feel anything, but that didn't stop her from climbing. She didn't know if she was climbing, she just tried. It seemed like forever until she saw the small picture. Once her hand touched it, she found herself back on Earth, inside of the graveyard. Next to her stood Mr. Sanders. He held lighter up. "I'm here," Vermon said, but Mr. Sanders couldn't hear her. He didn't share Vermon's gift. She went up to him and touched his face. A gust of wind almost sent his hat flying off and he had to hold on to it. Mr. Sanders smiled. "I see you made it. Believe it or not, it took you 2 hours. No worries. There's time." He flicked the light on. "Place the picture over the fire." Vermon was about to do as told when she heard something screech behind her. Cody was lying on his belly. His head was upside down and his beak was cracked into the sharp and twisted shape. It made him look like a painting that had gone completely wrong. "Vermon, do it!" Mr. Sanders yelled. "He can't hurt you. Don't look at him." "Put it down, Vermon," Cody spoke, his body then disappeared. "Come on, Vermon, he can't hurt you," Mr. Sanders said. Vermon rushed to the fire Mr. Sanders lit with the lighter. The picture slowly burned to a crisp and he watched as the ashes burned to the ground. The gargoyle statue that was only a few feet away began moving. Vermon couldn't warn Mr. Sanders. She touched him over and over, but he only asked what she was doing with the wind. The statue walked in a disturbing-like way, pausing with each movement. When it reached him, Mr. Sanders was too late to notice. The statue fell onto him, leaving a loud crunch in the air. Vermon took off running, out of the graveyard and into the streets. The sky began to turn gray. She didn't know what time it was, but she headed for her mother's house anyway. When she walked inside, she read the time on the wall. 11:32 p.m. Jacqueline walked out of her room, carrying photos then dropping them onto the ground. In another room, Vermon could hear someone screaming for help. She walked inside Jacqueline's room and saw the priest lying naked, a bed of wood. All 10 of his fingers and toes were nailed into the wood. His eyes were covered by 2 upside crosses. The priest's head lifted as soon as Vermon entered the room. "Vermon, I feel your presence. Please free me," he whispered. "Please." Vermon couldn't touch anything solid on the earth, so what could she do? She stood over his body, avoiding looking at his lower half. "How can you hear me?" He shook his head. "I can't tell you that." "Tell me," she said. "During every funeral, I burn something from the dead body then consume it so I am forever to keep in touch with them," he said. "Look at your finger." Vermon looked at her dead and ghostly fingers. Sure enough, one was missing. "You mean you ate my ashes?" "Vermon, there's no time to explain that." "Surely I do it for good," he said. "We're speaking, right? You need to find a way to free me." However, Vermon had no clue how to save him. Vermon felt a striking pain inside of her. Her arms and legs bulged. "He's here, it's too late," she told the priest. Suddenly, the doorbell was rung. Jacqueline saw Cody's body forming. She smiled at him before answering the door. "Good, you're here. It's almost time," she said. When she opened up the door, she saw a man holding onto a stick. The man held the stick into the air then brought it down upon Jacqueline's head. The man crumbled to the ground along with her. He breathed heavily as he tried to get up. "I would kill him if I could." "Get up, Jacqueline," Cody said, looking at the time. It was 11:45 p.m. "Fight him off, Vermon." "You can do it," Mr. Sanders said faintly. Jacqueline struggled to get up. She picked up the stick and raised over Mr. Sanders' neck, stabbing him right through the throat. Blood gushed out of his neck. Imbeciles! Cody yelled. Now you must perform the ritual on him. We do not have the time. We can dash. Jacqueline was cut off when Cody's face began to twitch. She saw Vermon's face, then Cody's, then Vermon. What's going on? She asked. She's overpowering me. We're running out of time. Perform the ritual before it's too late, he yelled. Jacqueline rushed over to the living room but was grabbed by Cody's arm. His face rapidly changed back and forth between his and Vermon. Do the ritual. Cody struggled to say. Jacqueline tried to pry her hand away but she couldn't. Cody's face was now replaced with Vermon's. Vermon looked at her mother angrily. You belong in hell, she said. Vermon dragged her inside of the kitchen towards the knives, then grabbed the largest one and held it over her mother. Vermon, what are you doing? Jacqueline asked with a fake smile. I'm your mother, she whispered, struggling to free herself. Don't kill me, I don't want to die. Vermon smiled back. Don't worry Mom, it's just dark and cold, and lonely. She stabbed her mother in the throat. Jacqueline fell limp to the ground. Vermon watched as the life drained out of her eyes. Vermon looked at Mr. Sanders. He was still breathing. She then went in the room with the priest. You did it, Vermon, he said to her. Please call an ambulance and dash. Vermon picked up a camera and walked back into the kitchen. The priest called after her but she ignored him. She took a picture of Jacqueline and when it printed, she carved the number 333 at the top with the knife. She then dragged her mother into the pile of pictures that was on the living room floor and threw her mother's onto them. Like I said, it's dark, cold, and lonely, Vermon frowned. Immortality doesn't sound so bad. The ritual can be done tonight, and using my gift I will free you in the morning. Vermon's face switched to Cody's. Exactly. Use your gift, get the money so you can free me. I will give you a never-ending life. You will never need to fear death again. The clock struck 11:59. Cody's face switched to Vermon's and she smiled. Good. Being dead sucks. Vermon watched as the pictures in front of her began dissolving into the floor. Black numbers formed on the wooden floor. It read, 333. Vermon's body shifted back to normal. Her arms, legs, everything was there. She looked at Mr. Sanders. He stared at her with wide eyes, then his life drained away. Vermon walked over to him and rubbed his head. Death is a scary thing. I don't want to die. I'm really sorry, she said, then walked out of the house. Vermon watched as the diggers dug Cody's coffin out of the grave. She'd raised enough money to put his grave out into the world. No one questioned her or even realized who she was. They only cared about all the money she had raised from being able to talk to the dead and coming back from the dead. Her powers sparked the world. She cared about her life. She did not wish to die. Her greed for immortality made her blind to the fact that Cody was now unleashed on the world and would soon cause its destruction.